Hey team! Today we're going to learn how we can use serverless functions to run custom processing on our Cloudinary images. In particular, we're going to use BlurHash to create low-resolution blurred placeholders for our media loading. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Cloudinary is a media platform that does a lot of things from media management to delivery. Now for this tutorial, we're more interested in the delivery, where we can do things with programmable media, such as add transformations, where in particular, we're going to add our own transformations using custom processing, using custom functions. Now, in order to run that custom processing, we're going to use Netlify, which is a platform that allows us to do a lot of things like deploy web apps really easily, as well as build custom APIs using serverless functions. So with these functions, we're able to take any kind of payload that's posted to that endpoint, and we're able to return whatever we want. And in particular, we're going to take our image data, process it, and then we're going to return it back to Cloudinary. Now the processing that we're going to run, we're going to use BlurHash, which is a pretty popular library for being able to generate these custom blurred placeholder images that gives us a better loading experience instead of trying to load the entire image all at once. And while BlurHash has a lot of different implementations for how we can choose and actually use it in our project, we're going to use TypeScript. And don't let TypeScript scare you if you're not a TypeScript fan. I'm not really familiar with TypeScript either, but we can install this using NPM and use it just like any other JavaScript module. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to start from scratch with a new project. So I'm going to create a new directory, make dir my function. I'm going to navigate into that function, and I'm going to run npm init, which is going to allow me to create a new npm project. Now, we're not going to need this right away, but it'll be useful when we install libraries later. Now, you can go through and answer all these questions, but I'm just going to hit enter through all of these, as for our particular purpose, they're not very important. Where now, if we look inside of that directory, we'll see we have that package.json. So now I'll open this up inside of my code project. Now, while this is also optional, I'm going to want to check this into GitHub at some point, so let's also initialize it as a Git repo. So I'm going to run git init, and then the only other thing I'm going to do is add a git ignore file, so .git ignore right at the root of my project, where I'm going to add node_modules. That way, when we install libraries, I'm not going to check in that entire directory of node modules. But now we're actually ready to start building our function. So to do this, like I said, we're going to use Netlify Functions. So to start, I'm going to create a Netlify configuration file. So in the root of my project, I'm going to create netlify.toml, where inside, all I'm going to do is specify a build setting, where inside of that, indented, I'm going to say that I want my functions to be located at functions. And you can choose whatever directory you want, but all I'm saying is that any functions that I create, I'm saying I want those to be located at this directory. So with that said, I'm going to create that new directory called functions, and inside I'm going to create a new file called blurhash.js, where this is going to be where we create that function. Now, rather than typing all this out, I'm going to go ahead and paste in this little snippet, but what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new handler on my exports where I'm saying I want to create an asynchronous function. Inside of that, we're going to receive two arguments, the event and the context, which we're not going to use right away, but we can see that inside of our function, all we're going to do is we're going to return this new object where we have a status code, which is important, where we're saying this is going to be a successful request. But then we also have our body, which I'm stringify this object, where I'm just saying that I'm going to pass in the status of okay. Now, before we go any further, let's test this out. And to test this out, I'm going to use the Netlify CLI. If you're not familiar with the Netlify CLI, it's just an easy way for us to be able to interface with Netlify right from the command line. But on top of that, it gives us the ability to run the dev command, which can simulate how we're going to have things actually work in our actual Netlify apps. So once you have the Netlify CLI set up, we can simply run netlify dev, which is going to start up a new development server where it's going to give us the ability to make requests to this new function that we created right inside of our project. We can actually see that right away, Netlify will try to open this new server inside of the browser. Now, the tricky thing is we're not going to actually get that endpoint right away, because that's going to be the base of the project, such as if we have a web app in that root of the project. But if we start to play around with the URL and we go to /.netlify, and you can even see that it's already pre-populating in my browser, but .netlify/functions, and then the function name, where in particular ours is called BlurHash, since that's the file name, we can go to that location and we can start to see that we now get that status of okay. Now, on top of using Netlify Dev, I like to be able to test my endpoints in a way that's going to be manageable for me rather than just trying to push those changes out every single time. So with this particular request that we made, this is only making a GET request since we're inside of the browser itself, but we're going to want to make a POST request when working with our image data to simulate how Cloudinary is working with this. So to do this, we can use Postman. If you're not familiar with Postman, it's a great tool for being able to test APIs. It also helps you build APIs and test them in a programmatic way, but we're just going to use it for simple purposes of trying to post a request to our endpoint. So inside of Postman, if you create a new directory and you actually create a new request, we're going to have this form where we can fill out all of our information. So first of all, we want to make sure we have post selected, as that's what we're going to actually be using. But I'm going to paste in that URL right inside of that bar at the top, where this is going to be where we're going to send our request to, which is our local host area. And we can see here that we have a body. Now, what we want to do is select form data, as that's what we're going to be using for the project. But just to start, we can say send here, where we're going to be able to send that request in the test, and we're going to immediately see that since nothing's actually happening, we're going to immediately get that response back of status of okay. Now, we want to actually simulate how Cloudinary is sending the data to our endpoint. So if we go to the documentation for custom functions on Cloudinary, which I'll include in the description, and we scroll all the way down to remote functions, which is what we're mostly interested in here, we're going to be able to see the request structure, where we don't really necessarily need to worry about the headers right now, but we're more interested in the file and the metadata here, where we're going to be sending this as form data, which we'll see how in a second, where we want to send a binary image file, which is just a regular image, and we're going to send the metadata. Now, again, we don't need to worry about the metadata either for our particular project, but this allows you to do more complex things, such as we see here, current page, tags, coordinates. It gives us a lot of options for expanding on the flexibility of what we're going to be doing today. But what that means is inside of Postman, we first want to make sure we have form data selected, but then I'm going to say for my key, my first key, I'm going to say files. And as my value, we can see that on the left here, this is going to pop up. I want that to be a file, where if I click select file, I can actually go ahead and then select my image file that I want to use. And we can see that it's now showing that right inside of this request. Now, alternatively, if you do want to use metadata, you can also add that metadata key, as you can then pass in the value of what you're actually trying to pass through. And it's going to be a stringified version, but we don't actually have any metadata that we want to pass through, so we're going to leave that as blank. But at this point, if we try to hit send again, it's going to send that request, and we're still only going to get that status of okay, because again, we're not doing anything with it yet. Now, if we try to actually console log out our event.body and we send the request, and we'll notice that it looks like a bunch of garbage. And the issue is we're trying to accept a multi-part form where we're not reading it properly. So we need to use a tool in order to do so. Now, the tool we'll use is lambda-multipart-parser, which is just an easy way for us to pass in that body, or the event rather, and get that form back. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the name. I'm going to head to my terminal, and you can either use npm or yarn. I'm going to use npm for this one, but I'm going to say npm install my lambda-multipart-parser. I'm going to add save at the end. And once it's done, we can run Netlify dev again. And for actually adding this and using it, the first thing we're going to do is use it just like we see inside here. I'm going to copy and paste that right in. Where at the top of my BlurHash file, I'm going to keep that constant of parser that I'm going to require, but I'm going to move this result right inside of the actual handler. So let's actually console log out that result. So now this time when I actually trigger that request, we see a completely different response here, where we do see our file inside of here, and particularly that buffer, which is going to be our image data, as well as the file name, where also the metadata, which we're really not really worrying about that for now, but we can see that we are successfully now parsing that image data so that we can use it. So the next step is a tricky part, so hopefully you can follow along with me here, but I'm going to do a lot of copying and pasting, because what we need to do is, in order to pass in this data into BlurHash, it needs to be accepted in a particular way. Now what we're going to do is we're going to first encode our original image data, which needs to be passed in a certain format, but then we want to also decode it, which allows us to pass it back to Cloudinary in its particular data format. Now, in order to do that back and forth for actually working with that image data so that it's a sane, manageable way, we're going to use a library called Sharp. And if you're familiar with the Gatsby ecosystem, you've probably seen this package installed as part of that bundle. So let's install both of those packages. I'm going to run npm install BlurHash and my Sharp, and I'm going to run save. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be doing a lot of copying and pasting just for the sake of being able to work through this fast. Now, I'm going to include all the resources inside of the description of this video. I'm also going to include a code example so that you can follow along with the actual code, as well as a written tutorial, so hopefully you can follow along here with me. But what I just did here is I paste in my require statement for both BlurHash and Sharp, where the first thing I'm going to do for BlurHash is I'm going to use the encode and the decode modules. And for Sharp, I'm just going to import that as is. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to do two things with BlurHash. First, we're going to encode it and we're going to decode it. So if I paste in those two methods or functions as we see inside the documentation, we're going to see that we're going to first encode this image data, which we're going to do something in between, but just to visualize this, we're going to first encode it where we're going to pass in the image data, the width and height of that image data, as well as these additional parameters of 4, and we're going to then decode it so we can pass it back, where we're going to pass that encoded data along with that original width and height so that we can transform it back into a usable image format. Now, in order to actually pass in this image data into that data, we're going to first use Sharp in order to transform it into that format. So above that encoded statement, I'm going to paste this in where I'm going to use the Sharp library and I'm going to await it, where I'm going to pass in my result and I'm going to locate the files, where if we look at the terminal, again, we're going to be able to see we're going to get that files key where inside the first array, we're only passing in one image and we're going to grab the content. So we can see here, we're doing just that, result files. We're going to grab that first item of the array and we're going to grab its content. We're going to pass that into Sharp, where we're going to make sure that we're ensuring alpha. Now, I don't know the technical bits of this, but it's going to help us actually maintain the image consistency so that we are working with the proper data. But then we're going to turn it into raw, and we're going to make sure that we're going to grab the buffer so that we can actually keep it in that format that BlurHash is going to understand. But ultimately, what we want out of this is we want the data and we want the info, where I'm going to pass that data right into encode, but we're going to use the info, which includes metadata. And particularly, it has our width and our height, which is exactly what we want in order to make this work. Now, here's another twist that we need to do. We can't just pass in this data as is, where a buffer, it needs to be a clamped buffer. Now, again, I'm not an expert in actually understanding how these little bits and pieces work, but ultimately what we need to do is we need to say we want to turn this data into a new UINT 8 clamped array. So we wrap it with the new instance of this, which is going to allow us to pass it into this encode function along with the rest of that metadata. So that was a lot of copying and pasting so far, right? So let's actually see where we're at. So I'm going to console log out the encoded. I'm going to also console log out the decoded, and these values aren't really going to mean anything to us, but just to see the progress. Now, one thing I also forgot here is we want to make sure we are passing in that encoded into the decode function, because that's the whole point, right? We're going to encode it into the BlurHash and then decode it so that we can pass it back as our raw image format. But now once we click send, we can see that we get that successful status along with that encoded and decoded image data, where that short string is going to be a small representation of the original image that we actually passed into the function, as well as that clamped array version, which is exactly what BlurHash is passing it back as, so that we can now take that and turn it into a format that Cloudinary will understand. So as my last big paste in, I'm going to go ahead and paste in this snippet, where this is where we're finally going to turn it into that format that Cloudinary understands, where again, we're going to use the Sharp library and we're going to grab a buffer from that decoded data that we just saw inside of the console. And with that, we're going to specify our raw configuration. Now, I was able to use this information that I actually researched through the library and looking through issues to try to figure out how this works. So I'm not exactly sure what every single little knob and setting actually does, but this is how we're able to actually make it work in this process. But once I have my configuration and the proper channels, which should correlate with what we set inside of the above encoding, we grab the JPEG instance along with the quality, we can set it to a buffer, and now we're ready to pass it back to Cloudinary. Now, back inside of the Cloudinary documentation, we can see exactly what we need in order to send this back. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this object so we can paste it into our own project. So I'm going to do it right above where I'm going to say I'm going to return that object. And of course we can edit this a little bit. I don't like to have these quotes, but let's just leave them for now for the sake of simplicity. But what we want to do is we want to take this image and we want to use, instead of the result, we're going to use that image. So I'm going to say image length and get rid of the quotes around it so that it's in a dynamic value, as well as the image. And we want to pass it back as a base64 representation. So we're going to leave that toString base64 on there. So again, what we're doing here is we're pasting in, or rather we're using a status code of 200, just like we were doing before, but we're going to set these headers where we're going to set the content type to JPEG. We're going to set the content length to the actual length of the image that we processed. We're going to tell Cloudinary that it is base64 encoded, and then our body is going to be simply that image transformed into a base64 string. I can get rid of this last return statement, but now we're actually ready to go to see how this is going to work. Now, if I head back into Postman and click send, it's going to take a second to do that processing. And now that we run that function, we can see that I actually hit a snag. Now, one caveat and one limitation of our Netlify functions is we're limited to 10 seconds. So if I pass in a file that's really big or something that's going to take a long time for BlurHash to process and send back, it's going to give us this timeout message. Now, there's other options that we could use, such as a raw serverless function, but I like how Netlify is just easy to use, and that's why I'm using this as this example. But we can see how this is going to have those limitations for us. So I'm going to instead try a different file where if I open up my navigation, I'm going to go to documents and I'm going to grab my Colby Hug file, which this time it's just going to be 600 by 600. I'm going to go ahead and click send again. This time we were able to complete that within that 10 seconds, and we can see that we now have that blurred representation right inside of the response that we see inside of Postman, meaning it worked. Now, if you're not familiar with that photo, it's the photo that I use for my avatar for everything. But we can see that what this photo looks like here is what was used to actually create this blurred representation. But now that we have our function, let's deploy this out so that we can actually use it inside of our Cloudinary processing. So in order to deploy this to Netlify, the first thing I did was I put this up on GitHub where I'm going to deploy my Netlify project from this GitHub repository. Next, once I'm actually logged into Netlify, I'm going to click add new site and I'm going to import an existing site where I'm already using GitHub and I'm already authorized, but if you're not, it's going to ask you to log in. But now I can search for my function, which as soon as that search request completes and is looking through all my repositories, I'm going to be able to select this actual repo where now we don't really have any build settings. We set up that netlify.toml file earlier so that it can detect where our functions are. So all we need to do is scroll through all this and click deploy site. Now at this point, Netlify is going to get the party started, and it looks like I have friendly bubblegum where it's going to deploy my function to Netlify. And since we're only really deploying that one function, it should be pretty quick, which it was. It's already published. So I'm going to go ahead and click functions where we can see what functions are actually deployed. We have my BlurHash function and we can see the endpoint here. So I'm going to copy that endpoint. And I'm going to head back into Postman. I'm going to paste that inside of the URL bar, and I'm going to click send. And we can see that it's again sending that request just like it did before, but this time it's actually hitting Netlify servers. And we can see it's working just as expected and just as it did when we were testing locally. So we now have that deployed function. So now we want to actually be able to use this function in our pipeline. And to do that, I'm not going to spin up a demo application, but what I'm going to do is show you how we can use it in a sample script in order to generate it. So if we look inside of this remote functions under that same documentation that's in the description of this YouTube video, we can see that we can generate our Cloudinary image, or I'm going to use Cloudinary URL, which is basically the same thing, where we're going to sign our URL, meaning we need to pass in our API key and our API secret, but we're going to say we want to specify a custom function. It's going to be remote, and it's going to be that endpoint that we specify. Now for this test script, I'm going to use the Cloudinary SDK. So inside of my project, I'm going to run npm install Cloudinary. And for this particular use case, I only need it for development because all I'm doing is using this for testing. I don't actually need it for my function. So I'm going to run save dev at the end so that it doesn't actually get bundled up and deployed for my production application. But now let's actually build our script. So inside of my directory, I'm going to create a new folder called scripts, and I'm going to just say a new file, and let's say generate image.js, where inside this is where we're going to actually use the Cloudinary SDK to generate that image. So the first thing we need is that Cloudinary library. So I'm going to say const Cloudinary is equal to require Cloudinary, and at the end, Cloudinary, I'm going to say I want to grab the v2 instance of that SDK. But then we're going to run cloudinary.config, where this is going to be where we're going to pass in our cloud name, API key, and secret. Now, because I don't want you accidentally committing this into your own repository, let's use a .env file, which means we're going to have to add one more dev dependency, but it's safer this way. So let's add a .env file in the root of our project, where we're going to specify our Cloudinary cloud name, and we're going to add that later, a Cloudinary API key, and our Cloudinary API secret. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to need another dependency for that, and what we're going to use is .env, which is a popular library for managing .env files. So I'm going to run npm install .env, and I'm going to run save dev as well for this, as we only need it for running this script locally. Now, in order to make .env work, all we need to do is run require.env, and at the end, we're going to run config right away. So that means we can now use environment variables throughout this file. So you know I like to paste things, so I'm going to go ahead and paste in what we're going to specify our cloud name, our API key, and our API secret, and we're seeing that we're accessing those values from process.env and those variables that we just defined inside of our .env file. So now we need to actually specify those values in that .env file so that when it gets pulled in, it actually has it to use. So once we're inside of our Cloudinary dashboard, we're going to see right at the top under account details, we have all that data that we need. So I'll first copy my cloud name, and inside of my .env file, I'll paste that in, as well as my API key, which I'll paste in, and finally my API secret, which you've guessed it, I'm going to paste that in as well. So finally, we're at a point where we can actually use Cloudinary to generate our image. So I'm going to say constant image is equal to cloudinary.url. And again, you can use image or URL. The nice thing about image is it creates an image tag, where URL only gives you the URL of that image, where we're going to paste in a first argument of a public ID, which I'll show you in a second, but then we're going to pass in the configuration. First, in order to use a custom function, we need to sign the URL. So I'm going to specify sign underscore URL is true, and we want to make sure this is a secure URL. So I'm going to say secure is equal to true, meaning it'll be HTTPS. But then we want to actually define our custom function. So that's going to be a new object where we're going to define a function type of remote, I can't type. And then we're going to define the source, which this is going to be our endpoint that we just saw for Netlify. So I'm going to paste in that Netlify endpoint right inside of the source there. So all we need now is our public ID, but once this is processed, we're going to console log that out so that we can grab that URL. But let's grab our public ID. Now inside of your Cloudinary media library, once you're logged in, we can see that I just have one image in here since it's a demo account, but this is going to be our public ID right here, this string. So I'm going to double click this image to actually navigate it to it. And at the top, I'm just going to grab this string so I can paste it in as my public ID. So I'm going to paste it in right inside, and now we can see that this is going to generate our image for us. So let's actually run this script. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to run node scripts generate image, where it's going to take a few seconds, but once we have it, we have our image URL, which was generated by that Cloudinary script. And if I open that up inside my browser, we can see that that just generated and used that custom remote function in order to generate that request. And if we inspect the URL here, we can start to parse it, where I know it's a little hard to see since the browser, I can't actually expand the URL bar, but we have our signature here, where let's just get rid of that for first. We're going to have our remote function, which we defined here. I can also get rid of that. But if I now load that, which it's just the public ID of my uploaded images, we can see that I have that original image. But as soon as I go back, including that signature and that remote function, we can see that I ran that custom processing and I now have that blurred representation. The great thing is once we make that first request and it processes it, it's now stored and cached inside the Cloudinary CDN. So all those subsequent hits will be lightning fast and performant. Now, before you commit this up or save this script, if you even plan on doing that, make sure, because we did add those env file with our environment variables and our API secret and key, make sure that you head over to your git ignore file and add that .env so that you don't accidentally commit those secrets into your GitHub account. You want to make sure you're not exposing those so people can't compromise your account. Now, if you accidentally already did that, you can head over to Cloudinary and regenerate your API key under settings, but just make sure that you're trying to avoid that as much as you can. But as we can see, by being able to take advantage of serverless functions, and in this case, Netlify Functions, we were able to use our Cloudinary processing to run custom processing on our image. Well, here I just used a blurred placeholder. You can imagine that we have a lot of capabilities, such as AI detection or really custom processing for any of your media needs. As much as Cloudinary provides a lot of tools to be able to do things that you don't even need to worry about custom processing, being able to manage that and have your own set of custom capabilities really expands what we're able to do to take advantage of that tool set. What kind of things would you like to see custom processing on images? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to create more examples of how we can use this in a practical way. If you want to learn more about working with serverless functions, in particular, we can see how we can use Puppeteer to automatically do things inside of serverless functions, such as maybe we're going to grab a screenshot and pass that back to Cloudinary. You can check that out in my video, Automating Chrome in an API with Puppeteer and Netlify serverless functions. Or if you want to learn more about how we can use more Cloudinary capabilities for media, check out my video, AI Image Recognition for Auto Tagging with Google Vision AI and Cloudinary. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.